The spring of 1945 brought with it the final days of World War II in Europe. The Third Reich, which had spread across the continent like a long and cold shadow, was now devastated. While the American forces advanced from the west, the Red Army closed in from the east. Berlin was definitively besieged, and the Oder-Neisse line, the Reich's last defensive line, located 60 kilometers from the capital, was teetering on the brink of collapse. General Gotthard Heinrici, in command of the front, was one of the few German military leaders who dared to face the harsh reality of the situation. A veteran of World War I and a consummate strategist, Heinrici knew the war was lost. His troops were exhausted, outnumbered and out-resourced, and no reinforcements were coming. However, despite his understanding of the situation, Hitler and the Nazi high command still clung to a strange mix of illusions and despair. By late January, the Red Army crossed the Polish plain from the Vistula River and launched its final offensive toward Berlin. The Oder-Neisse line was manned by soldiers who could barely be considered effective. Young recruits from the Hitler Youth, elderly veterans and battalions composed of remnants of decimated units. Morale was in the gutter, and although the fortifications along the Oder River were solid, there was not enough artillery or ammunition to withstand the Soviet war machine. Heinrici, who was appointed commander of Army Group Vistula in early March, was known for his ability to organize strategic retreats and for his ruthless realism. He knew that defending the Oder-Neisse line would only delay the inevitable. However, as a professional soldier, his duty was to resist as long as possible, trying to give civilians more time to evacuate. By April 1945, communications between the different German fronts were practically broken. Field generals, isolated from each other, struggled to coordinate operations with the high command in Berlin. Chaos reigned not only on the battlefield, but also in the upper echelons of German leadership. The soldiers gathered along the Oder River under Heinrici's command formed one of the few fronts where some semblance of military organization still existed. However, even there, the lack of supplies, the exhaustion of the troops, and the unstoppable advance of the Soviet army made it impossible to hold the defensive line. Meanwhile, Hitler, hidden in his bunker under the Reich Chancellery, absolutely deranged, refused to face reality and continued issuing orders increasingly disconnected from the actual situation. Morale among the German troops was disastrous. The soldiers knew there was no hope of victory and that the end was near. Stories of atrocities committed by the Red Army, fueled by Nazi propaganda, had sown terror among both the troops and the civilian population. Many opted to surrender to the Western Allies, hoping to avoid falling into Soviet hands, while others continued to fight, whether out of honor, blind loyalty to Hitler, or fear of reprisals. The Nazi leadership, however, was trapped in its own delusion. While Heinrici tried to maintain order and organize an effective defense just a few kilometers from Berlin, Himmler, Göring, and other high-ranking leaders still believed in a possible miraculous salvation. Between March and April, the Soviet advance became unstoppable. Despite Heinrici's efforts to strengthen defenses along the Oder, the overwhelming weight of Soviet artillery and armored forces broke through the German lines. The cities along the river began to fall one after another, and the road to Berlin was finally cleared. The Reich's fortress was surrounded. Desperate efforts to halt the advance proved futile. The German troops, caught between the Soviet advance and Hitler's increasingly irrational orders, were demoralized and poorly equipped. Heinrici did what he could, organizing strategic retreats that temporarily delayed the inevitable, but he himself knew the defense would not last much longer. The situation was unsustainable. Soviet troops crossed the river in mid-April, and Berlin was completely surrounded by the 25th. Heinrici knew that the final collapse of the Third Reich was near. Hitler himself, in his bunker, had realized that victory was no longer possible, but he refused to surrender. The fall of Berlin would thus mark the end of the Nazi regime, and the front formed around the Oder River, the last stronghold of the Third Reich, though it had held out longer than expected, became another symbol of the military and strategic failure of the regime. Gotthard Heinrici, the messenger of defeat. In a war that seemed endless, Gotthard Heinrici stood out as one of the most pragmatic and realistic commanders of the German army. Throughout his military career, Heinrici had earned a reputation as an implacable strategist, more interested in concrete results than in personal glory or ideological fanaticism. This practical and unsentimental approach led him to become the commander of the Oder Front in the final months of the Third Reich, when the reality of defeat was evident to all except Adolf Hitler and his inner circle. Heinrici, a descendant of an old landowning family from East Prussia, was not the typical Nazi general. His personal and military background set him apart from many of his colleagues in the high command. Unlike officers like Himmler or Göring, Heinrici was not a man seduced by the cult of Hitler or by Nazism. He saw himself above all as a professional soldier. Although he had served the Nazi regime for most of his career, his loyalty was directed more towards Germany than towards the Nazi Party, of which he refused to become a member. Born in 1886, Heinrici was a veteran of World War I, where he had demonstrated his skill in defensive tactics. During World War II, he stood out for his ability to organize effective defenses, often in desperate conditions. This ability made him a crucial figure in the final weeks of the war, when he was assigned to defend the last line of defense before Berlin. Heinrici was known for his austere and reserved character. He was not a man given to grand gestures or speeches, preferring instead to let his strategic decisions speak for themselves. In an environment where personality cults and propaganda dominated, Heinrici was a rare exception, a commander more concerned with efficiency than politics. The son of a Protestant minister, Heinrici was also a religious man, attending church regularly and reading the Bible every evening. His religious beliefs and his connection to the old Prussian landowning aristocracy made him unpopular with the Nazi hierarchy, and he was strongly detested by Göring, who forced him into a rest home in Karlovy Vary at the end of 1943 due to his apparent poor health, which was actually a punishment for opposing the burning of the Russian city of Smolensk after the Battle of Kursk. When he was appointed commander of Army Group Vistula in March 1945, Heinrici inherited a disastrous situation. The Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly from the east, having swept away everything in their path. The Oder River, located to the east of Berlin, represented the last barrier before the Red Army could invade the German capital. Heinrici knew that his troops, a mixture of exhausted veterans, inexperienced youths, and conscripts, were not in a position to face the Soviet military power. Despite that, he assumed command with the purpose of delaying the inevitable for as long as possible. He organized the defense of the river using tactics that had proven effective throughout the war. He ordered the construction of fortifications, placed the few troops he had in strategic positions, and planned a defense in depth to wear down the enemy forces. However, Heinrici knew that the German army could not hold out indefinitely. The defense of the river was nothing more than an illusion, a desperate attempt to buy time. With an enemy superior in numbers and resources and with his troops' morale in decline, Heinrici found himself in a desperate situation. Despite his efforts to strengthen the defense, Heinrici understood that Berlin would inevitably fall. It was only a matter of time before the German lines broke and Soviet forces advanced on the capital. However, the truly tragic aspect of his situation was that Hitler and his inner circle were unwilling to accept reality. Finally, in April 1945, Heinrici was summoned to a meeting with Hitler and other regime leaders in Berlin. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss the situation on the front and possible strategies for defending the capital. Heinrici, always direct and pragmatic, informed Hitler that the war was lost. The Red Army was about to cross the river, and there were not enough troops or resources to stop its advance. Any further resistance would be futile and would only prolong the suffering of German soldiers and civilians. Hitler's reaction was predictable. Unable to accept the truth, the Führer responded with anger and denial. He ordered Heinrici to continue the defense at all costs, clinging to the hope that some sort of miracle might save the Third Reich at the last moment. Heinrici, however, knew that this miracle would never come. Heinrici continued organizing the defense of the Oder, but also took measures to avoid the total destruction of his troops. He ordered strategic withdrawals when necessary and made sure that civilians had time to escape before the Red Army arrived. Although he knew his time was running out, he remained committed to mitigating suffering amid the chaos. With what little he had left, Heinrici managed to halt the Soviets on the Silo Heights in front of Zhukov's armies, slowing their advance toward the capital, forcing Stalin to order Marshal Ivan Konev to reach the outskirts of the German capital from the south as soon as possible. Unwilling to gather more troops from the west for a desperate battle for Berlin, Heinrici ordered a retreat north of the city. On April 28th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel was riding on the roads north of Berlin when he observed troops from the 7th Panzer Division and the 25th Panzer Grenadier Division marching north away from the city. These troops were part of Hasso von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army. As one of the two armies that made up Heinrici's army group Vistula, it was supposed to be on its way to Berlin, but instead Heinrici was leading it north in an attempt to stop the Soviet advance at Neubrandenburg against the orders of Keitel and his deputy, General Alfred Jodl. Keitel found Heinrici on a road near Neubrandenburg, accompanied by Manteuffel. The encounter led to a heated confrontation that resulted in Heinrici's dismissal on April 29th for disobeying orders. Pressed by Keitel to shoot the deserters, Heinrici challenged him to shoot the wounded and sick soldiers, who made up the majority of his troops, and calmly continued marching toward northern Berlin. The strategist in the shadows, Heinrici's path to the Oder. Heinrici was born in 1886 in Gumbinnen, the son of a minister of the Evangelical Church of Germany. He came from a long lineage of theologians from East Prussia, including his uncle Georg Heinrici and his grandfather Karl August Heinrici, and remained a devout Lutheran throughout his life. After graduating from high school in 1905, he broke with family tradition and enlisted in the army as a cadet in an infantry division on March 8, 1905. He attended a war school the following year. During World War I, Heinrici fought in the German invasion of Belgium and earned the Iron Cross Second Class in September 1914. Heinrici's division was transferred to the Eastern Front. There he fought in the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes and the Battle of Lodz, and received the Iron Cross First Class in July 1915. In May 1916, Heinrici participated in the Battle of Verdun. Starting in September 1916, he served in staff positions in the 24th Reserve Corps and the 115th Infantry Division. In March 1917, Heinrici was assigned to the German General Staff. In September, he attended a staff officer's training course and later served as a staff officer in the 7th Corps and 8th Corps. In February 1918, Heinrici was assigned to an infantry division as a staff officer responsible for operations. In this position, he was awarded the Prussian Knight's Cross of the Royal House Order of Hohenzollern with swords in August 1918. After Germany's defeat in 1918, Heinrici remained in the reduced Reichswehr army, where he continued to hone his military skills. However, unlike many officers of the time, Heinrici was not drawn to the rising tide of nationalism and radicalism sweeping through Germany. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, Heinrici had already risen to the higher ranks of the army, but never ideologically aligned himself with the regime. Despite serving under Nazi command for years, his loyalty remained more to the German army and his country than to Hitler or National Socialism. Heinrici had two children, Hartmut and Gisela, with his wife Gertrude, who had a Jewish parent. His children were therefore labeled Mischlinge under Nazi racial law. However, Heinrici received a certificate of German blood from Hitler himself, which validated their supposed Aryan status and protected them from discrimination. By the time World War II broke out, Heinrici was already an experienced commander. In the early years of the conflict, he primarily served on the Western Front during the invasion of France and on the Eastern Front after the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. During the battle in France, Heinrici's command was part of General Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb's Army Group C. He commanded the 12th Army Corps, which was part of the First Army. Heinrici's forces managed to break through the Maginot Line south of Saarbrücken on June 14, 1940. However, it was on the Eastern Front where Heinrici began to stand out as one of the Wehrmacht's top defensive strategists. In 1941, during Operation Barbarossa, Heinrici served in the 4th Army under Günther von Kluge as the general commanding the Kiktiat Army Corps during the Battle of Białystok-Minsk, the Battle of Kiev, and the Battle of Moscow. He was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in 1941. By late January 1942, Heinrici took command of the 4th Army. On November 24, 1943, he was awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross for his leadership during the Battle of Orsha, during which the 4th Army, taking defensive positions near the Orsha region in Belarus, temporarily halted the advance of the Western Front led by General Vasily Sokolovsky. During the Fourth Army's retreat, he inflicted significant losses on the advancing Red Army. These successes greatly contributed to Heinrici's reputation as a defensive specialist. In contrast to Hitler's expansionist ideology, which sought great offensive victories at any cost, Heinrici adopted a more realistic and measured approach, preferring tactics that protected his soldiers and maximizing opportunities for organized retreats when necessary. One of the most significant episodes of his career was the defense of Smolensk in 1943. After the German defeat at Stalingrad, the German army was in retreat on the Soviet front, and Heinrici was tasked with organizing the defense of a critical position to slow the Red Army's advance. Despite limited resources and a lack of reinforcements, Heinrici managed to delay the Soviet advance for several weeks, earning a reputation as a commander who knew how to make the most of difficult circumstances. This defensive victory was celebrated by the German High Command, but Heinrici was already beginning to generate tensions with some Nazi leaders, especially Göring, whom he blamed for not providing enough air support during battles in the East. In 1943, Heinrici publicly opposed the order to burn the city of Smolensk during the German retreat, arguing that such destruction was unnecessary and would only worsen the situation for civilians. This decision, along with his distant attitude towards National Socialism, earned him the displeasure of high-ranking regime officials, including Göring and Heinrich Himmler. It was in this context that Heinrici was temporarily sent to a rest home in Karlovy Vary under the pretext of health problems, although it was actually a reprisal for his disagreements with the Nazi leadership. In 1944, after the earlier successes of the Red Army in Ukraine, Heinrici repeatedly advocated for the withdrawal of Army Group Center and a concomitant shortening of the front line. Hitler rejected these plans during a General Staff meeting on May 20, 1944. On June 4th, Heinrici was relieved of his command of the Fourth Army, which was later encircled east of Minsk and almost destroyed during Operation Bagration. In the summer of 1944, after 8 months of forced retirement, Heinrici was sent to Hungary and placed in command of the 1st Panzer Army, as well as the 1st Hungarian Army attached to it. He was able to keep the 1st Panzer Army relatively intact as it retreated into Slovakia. Later, in 1944, during the Battle of the Dukla Pass, the 1st Panzer Army prevented Soviet forces from joining the Slovak rebel forces of the Slovak National Uprising. Heinrici was awarded the swords to the oak leaves of his Knight's Cross on March 3, 1945, just a month before the Third Reich's final collapse began in earnest. The Last Warning, the meeting that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. The meeting in which General Gotthard Heinrici informed the Nazi High Command, including Himmler, Göring and Hitler, about the collapse of the front is an event that has generated much interest, but the specific details are scarce. There are some things we can affirm with a certain degree of certainty, but much of what is known is based on later reports, indirect testimonies, and informed speculation due to the lack of direct records. Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, was a military leader known for his realism and willingness to face the reality of the German military disaster in the final days of the war. By the end of April 1945, the situation on the front was desperate, with the Red Army surrounding Berlin. Heinrici had earned a reputation as one of the most effective and tactical generals, but he was aware that the war was lost. On the other hand, the Nazi leadership was completely fragmented and under immense pressure. Hitler continued to trust in miraculous victories or impossible advances, while Göring and Himmler were more concerned with their own interests and potential deals with the Allies. In this context, Heinrici brought the news that the military situation was unsustainable, something that went against Hitler's expectations and those of the other high command members. There are no direct records such as minutes or recordings of the meeting. The sources about what happened in these meetings come mostly from later testimonies, diaries of figures close to the regime, or fragmentary military documentation. This means that many of the precise interactions between Heinrici and the Nazi leaders have been reconstructed or inferred. Some generals and officers who survived the war, such as Alfred Jodl or Wilhelm Keitel, mentioned in their testimonies Hitler's growing frustration with his generals in the last weeks of the war. Heinrici, as a pragmatic realist, likely clashed with Hitler's denial. His attempt to avoid a direct and bloody confrontation in Berlin by withdrawing his forces and partially disobeying the orders of his superiors put him in a critical position with the Führer. Present at the meeting were, among others, Keitel, Wilhelm Burgdorf, Martin Bormann, Hans Krebs, Karl Dönitz, and, of course, Himmler, Göring, and Hitler. Up until that moment, Heinrici had only had contact with the Führer on a few occasions, and the impression he got of him that day was not the best. According to his autobiography, published after the war, Hitler, wandering like a shadow through the bunker, completely deranged, lost in his delusions, seemed like the walking dead. Heinrici tried to describe the situation as best as possible. He pointed to a huge map spread over a wooden table showing the disposition of the armies gathered around the Oder, warning about the scarce resources available to the 3rd Panzer Army, located north of the river, and stated that everything would be lost once the waters receded, leaving the German soldiers exposed to the savage Soviet onslaught. Heinrici had no troops in the rear capable of covering the breaches that would open in the front line since the reserve armies had been sent to Prague, where it was believed the main offensive would take place. Krebs was the first to intervene, promising Heinrici that he would receive reinforcements in the coming weeks. Everyone knew it was a lie. Seeing Heinrici's hopeless expression, Hitler claimed that the Soviet army's situation was similar to the German army's, so the battle would be evenly matched. Another lie. Göring assured that the Luftwaffe would provide men for the battle. Himmler, not wanting to be outdone, stated that the SS would do the same. Not wanting to be left behind, Dönitz, who commanded the Kriegsmarine, asserted that his sailors would leave the ships and head immediately towards the Oder. Heinrici wrote in his autobiography that at this point the meeting had turned into an auction. The high command of the Nazi regime was simply competing to see who could offer the most empty promises. Heinrici knew that the soldiers being offered would only serve to increase the number of casualties. It was all useless. Just a few days later, Göring invited Heinrici to lunch at Carinhall, his country residence located on the outskirts of Berlin, just 30 kilometers from the Oder, where the Luftwaffe commander-in-chief enjoyed a life of luxury, spending hours contemplating the artworks his army had confiscated from occupied cities and organizing huge parties where he dressed in a Roman toga and jeweled sandals, covered his fingers with rings, and painted his nails and lips, pretending to be Nero, the ancient Roman emperor, and drowning in ridiculous doses of dihydrocodeine. The bad relationship between Heinrici and Göring was well known to everyone within the Nazi regime's upper ranks, and dated back to 1942 when the disaster of the 6th Army's airlift took place. The blame, according to Heinrici, lay with Göring. For his part, Göring accused Heinrici of insubordination. The meeting did not last long, and there is little information about it in Heinrici's autobiography. The messenger of defeat, insulted and unmoved, only noted that upon leaving, he asked Göring to wish him luck since he would do everything possible to save his palace from the Soviet advance. Eventually, the Red Army launched its offensive a few kilometers south of Carinhall. However, on April 28th, Göring ordered his subordinates to destroy the mansion, named in honor of his late wife, stating that it was preferable to it falling into Soviet hands. Göring later sent a telegram to the Führer bunker. Through its few and trembling lines, Hitler glimpsed Göring's intention to stage a coup, which led him to confine Göring under surveillance in a residence in the Alps, where he would be discovered shortly after by Allied forces. Carinhall in ruins, the end of Göring and his empire. Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful men of the Third Reich, was for a long time the second in command after Adolf Hitler. Reich Marshal, founder of the Luftwaffe and president of the Reichstag, Göring played a key role in the rise of Nazism and the German war machine. However, as the Third Reich began to crumble, so did Göring's position within the regime. His final downfall was marked by a series of controversial decisions and, ultimately, his arrest, culminating in the collapse of Carinhall, his luxurious residence, a symbol of his grandeur and decadence. At the beginning of the war, Göring was one of Germany's most influential leaders. However, as the conflict dragged on and German defeat became more apparent, his influence and relationship with Hitler began to deteriorate. The Luftwaffe, once Göring's pride, failed in defending the Reich during the Battle of Britain and later in stopping the Allied bombings over Germany. This significantly undermined his military and political reputation. Göring, who had been designated by Hitler as his official successor in 1941, began to see the end of the war as an opportunity to assume leadership. Believing that Hitler was incapacitated due to the deteriorating situation in Berlin, Göring sent a telegram on April 23, 1945, from his residence in the Bavarian Alps, suggesting that he should take command of the Reich. This political maneuver was seen by Hitler as a betrayal. Göring's telegram unleashed the Führer's fury. Despite years of loyalty and being his designated successor, Hitler accused him of high treason. In a moment of extreme paranoia, Hitler could not tolerate any sign of disloyalty. In response, Göring was stripped of all his titles and arrested by the SS under Hitler's orders. On the same day he sent the telegram. With his arrest, Göring's political and military career came to a dramatic end. The man who had once been seen as the second most powerful figure in the Third Reich ended up as a prisoner of his own regime, isolated and humiliated. Carinhall, Göring's majestic residence, built about 65 kilometers north of Berlin in the Schorfheide forest, was both a symbol of his power and his extravagance. The estate was named in honor of his first wife, Karin Göring, and was decorated with valuable artworks and treasures that Göring had accumulated over the years, many of them looted from territories occupied by Nazi Germany. Göring referred to the residence as a retreat where he could relax far from the frenetic political and military life in Berlin. Carinhall was much more than just a residence. It was a demonstration of the luxury and power Göring had amassed during the years of Nazi expansion. With meticulously designed gardens, sumptuous salons, and an impressive art collection, the mansion embodied Göring's hedonism and his inclination for grandeur. However, as Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin in the spring of 1945, Carinhall's fate was sealed. Göring, aware that Berlin's fall was inevitable, took drastic measures to prevent his beloved palace from falling into enemy hands. In the final days of the war, Göring ordered the evacuation of his most valuable artworks and treasures from Carinhall. Much of this wealth was transported to the Bavarian Alps, where Göring hoped to take refuge and perhaps negotiate with the Allies from a position of power. Although this idea of negotiation was unrealistic in those desperate moments, Göring still believed he could save himself from the total destruction of the Third Reich. On April 28, 1945, under Göring's orders, Luftwaffe soldiers placed explosive charges in Carinhall. The plan was to completely destroy the property to prevent the rapidly advancing Soviets from taking possession of it. In a final display of control over his own fate, Göring detonated Carinhall, reducing the mansion to rubble. This action was symbolic not only of Göring's personal collapse, but also of the collapse of the Third Reich. After the destruction of Carinhall, Göring moved to his residence in the Alps, hoping to find an opportunity to negotiate with the Western Allies. He believed that due to his previous contacts and influence within the Nazi Party, he could present himself as a negotiating figure between the remnants of the Nazi regime and the victors. However, this hope turned out to be an illusion. On May 6, 1945, Göring was arrested by American soldiers in the town of Fischhorn. Despite his attempt to assume a relevant role in the post-war period, Göring was quickly transferred to prison. He was one of the main defendants at the Nuremberg trials, where he was charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy to commit crimes against peace. Shortly before, on April 12th, the Berlin Philharmonic held its last concert. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production and the Third Reich's official architect, organized a special program that included Beethoven's Violin Concerto in D major, followed by Bruckner's Fourth Symphony, nicknamed the Romantic, and concluded with Brunhilde's aria that closes the third act of Wagner's Götterdämmerung, during which the Valkyrie immolates herself on a great funeral pyre whose flames will consume the world of men, the hall and warriors of Valhalla, and the pantheon of the gods. When the audience made their way to the exit, with Brunhilde's agonizing cries still echoing in their ears, 10-year-old boys from the Deutsches Jungvolk of the Hitler Youth handed out cyanide capsules in small wicker baskets. One of those capsules was likely the one Göring used to commit suicide just before his trial. His death marked the end of one of the principal architects of the Third Reich. His life, full of excess, power, corruption, and ambition, ended with the same kind of drama with which he had lived. In his final days, just like his Carinhall mansion, Göring self-destructed, leaving behind a legacy of decadence and destruction that reflected the total collapse of the Nazi regime. Himmler, the architect of his own ruin. In the final days of the Third Reich, desperation and denial defined the decisions of Nazi leaders. As the Allied forces advanced inexorably toward the heart of Germany, Heinrich Himmler, one of the regime's most powerful men, found himself at a crossroads. Despite the inevitable defeat, Himmler continued to cling to the hope of a miracle, or failing that, the possibility of saving himself by negotiating a separate peace with the Western Allies. For Himmler, who had been appointed commander of Army Group Vistula shortly before, the situation was equally desperate. His military experience was limited, and the incompetence he had demonstrated on the battlefield had become evident during the failed defense. However, during that meeting, Himmler seemed more concerned about the political consequences of defeat than the military reality. To him, the possibility of being seen as the man who had failed in the defense of Berlin was catastrophic, especially as he was already in the process of trying to save his own life through secret negotiations with the Allies. Although he publicly remained loyal to the Führer, privately, Himmler had begun to seek a way out. Through Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, he had attempted to open channels of negotiation with the Western Allies, hoping that his influence and position could secure him a role in a post-Hitler Germany, or at the very least guarantee his personal survival. However, in that meeting, he could not allow this betrayal to come to light, so he maintained a facade of loyalty, while Heinrici continued to describe the harsh reality of the front. During the meeting, while Hitler reacted with anger at Heinrici's news and Göring remained silent, Himmler adopted a distant stance. Though he knew the situation was hopeless, his concern seemed more focused on protecting his image than on seeking real solutions for Germany's defense. This disconnect between the military reality and Himmler's political ambitions would become even more apparent in the days that followed, when his attempts to negotiate with the Allies would be exposed, sealing his final fate. Himmler, accustomed to exerting absolute control over the SS and much of the regime's repressive machinery, now found himself in unfamiliar territory. Military matters, unlike concentration camps and internal security operations, were not his forte. But instead of recognizing his limitations and accepting the inevitability of defeat, Himmler clung to the illusion that he could still play a decisive role in the unfolding events. What Himmler didn't know at the time was that his betrayal was already in the process of being exposed. While he attempted to maintain his image in front of Hitler, his secret negotiations with the Allies began to leak. When Hitler learned of these efforts through his confidants, the rupture was definitive. The Führer, who had until that moment trusted Himmler implicitly, accused him of treason and stripped him of all his titles. Without Hitler's support and without the possibility of securing a separate peace, Himmler found himself completely isolated. His political and military influence evaporated within days, and in a last-ditch attempt to escape, he tried to pass himself off as a low-ranking soldier in disguise. However, he was captured by British forces on May 22, 1945. The final humiliation for one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich came when, after being detained, he ingested a cyanide capsule and committed suicide, ending his life as abruptly as his political career. Himmler's downfall not only marked the end of his life, but also symbolized the collapse of the Nazi regime. The figure who had once been synonymous with terror and control now became a mere memory of the failed ambitions of a man who believed himself to be the architect of Germany's future. His death also revealed the fragility of a system that had depended so much on fear and repression. Himmler's desperation to save his life, even at the cost of betraying his closest allies, reflected the internal decay of the Third Reich, a regime that had thrived on violence but was now consumed by paranoia and treachery. The days following his death showed the total disintegration of the Nazi power structure. Other leaders, like Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring, were swept up in a series of desperate decisions. Göring, for his part, had been trying to cling to his status and power, but his influence was also fading quickly. Meanwhile, the resistance in Berlin was crumbling, and German soldiers, caught between loyalty to a crumbling regime and impending defeat, faced the cruel reality of their situation. Himmler's betrayal of his own ideology and his Führer was a reflection of the state of chaos that dominated the Nazis in their final days. In his eagerness to survive, he sacrificed not only his legacy, but also the loyalty of those who had once trusted him. In the twilight of the Third Reich, personal ambition and desperation became the driving forces of a narrative that ended in ruin, where the former titans of power were dragged into darkness by their own fears and betrayals. The twilight of the Third Reich, the final resistance of Berlin. On April 16, 1945, Soviet forces, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, launched the Oder-Neisse offensive, the final phase of the siege of Berlin. The Allies had crossed the Rhine weeks earlier, and Germany was being strangled from both fronts. However, amid the chaos and destruction, some Nazi commanders still clung to the belief in an impossible victory, or at least the need for fanatical resistance until the end. As Soviet troops tightened their grip on Berlin, the resistance became a symbol of the collapse of the Nazi war machine. Helmuth Weidling, commander of the 56th Panzer Corps, was one of the main officers in charge of Berlin's defense. Although he had demonstrated notable strategic ability in his early engagements with the Soviets, Weidling found himself in a desperate situation when he was appointed by Hitler as the city's defense commander. By the time he took command on April 23rd, Berlin was practically surrounded, with military and logistical resources depleted. However, Weidling, understanding the situation, chose to continue resisting, not so much out of blind loyalty, but because any attempt at capitulation would have been rejected by Hitler himself, who remained in his underground bunker. Weidling organized the remaining troops, including young members of the Hitler Youth and elderly Volkssturm units, in an effort to slow the Soviet advance. Berlin was divided into resistance sectors with strict orders to fight to the last man. The commanders overseeing these areas were minor figures, many of whom shared Hitler's fight-or-die mentality. But as the days passed, even Weidling began to realize the inevitability of defeat. Faced with the reality that the city would be destroyed and its defenders annihilated, he made several attempts to convince the bunker officials that surrender was the only viable option. Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of a Waffen-SS division, was another key defender in Berlin's final days. Mohnke was responsible for defending the government district, which included the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler was holed up in his Führer bunker. A veteran of several campaigns on both the Western and Eastern fronts, Mohnke had been wounded in combat and had a reputation as a brutal and disciplined commander. In the last days of April, Mohnke oversaw the fierce resistance against Soviet forces advancing from the east. However, despite his fanatical loyalty to the regime, Mohnke was increasingly aware that the situation was unsustainable. Like Weidling, his main concern was not so much continuing to fight for the Third Reich, but protecting the soldiers and civilians trapped in the carnage that Berlin had become. With the Reichstag surrounded and Soviet artillery reducing the city center to rubble, Mohnke did what he could to avoid a complete massacre, but his efforts were largely unsuccessful. Inside the Führer bunker, as the military forces collapsed, the Nazi political leaders continued to cling to a sense of ideological fatalism. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich's Minister of Propaganda, was one of the most ardent defenders of resistance until the end. Appointed by Hitler as the Reich's final chancellor on April 30th, Goebbels fervently believed in the concept of a heroic sacrifice that in his mind would allow National Socialism to be reborn in the future, even after military defeat. Goebbels and his family remained in Berlin until the end, refusing to flee like other Nazi leaders. His fanaticism was so extreme that after Hitler's death on April 30th, Goebbels and his wife Magda made the tragic decision to murder their 6 children before committing suicide on May 1st. Goebbels was not a military commander in the traditional sense, but his ideological influence was key in maintaining the suicidal resistance mindset among the Nazi leaders who remained in Berlin. By May 1st, with Hitler dead and the Soviets just streets away from the Führer bunker, Helmuth Weidling, despite his duty to defend Berlin, understood that resistance was pointless. After multiple attempts to contact the Soviets to negotiate a surrender, Weidling ordered the remaining forces to cease fighting. On May 2nd, he formally handed the city over to Soviet troops. This act marked the end of the Battle of Berlin and the definitive collapse of the Third Reich. Despite the fanatical resistance promoted by Hitler and his closest followers, Most of the surviving commanders at the end understood the futility of continuing to fight. The city was in ruins, and any possibility of a German counterattack had been destroyed long ago. As the fighting ceased and the High Command surrendered, Berlin became a symbol of the end of the Nazi regime. The commanders who defended the city to the last breath reflected the mixture of fanaticism and desperation that characterized the Third Reich's final days. While some, like Weidling, chose to surrender in an attempt to save lives, others, like Mohnke and Goebbels, chose blind loyalty until the bitter end. Berlin was not only the scene of a last military stand, but also the place where the myth of National Socialism was crushed by the brutal reality of defeat. Between twilight and history, the unexpected legacy of Gotthard Heinrici. Heinrici was replaced by General Kurt Student, but it was General Kurt von Tippelskirch who had to be appointed as interim substitute until Student could reach the defensive line and take control of Army Group Vistula. However, Student was captured by the British before he could assume command. Ultimately, the rapid deterioration of the situation faced by the Germans made the coordination of Army Group Vistula under his nominal command during the final days of the war of little importance. Heinrici was summoned to Berlin and would have complied if Captain Helmuth Lang had not persuaded him to drive as slowly as possible toward the shores of Plön, informing him that if he went to the capital, he would be killed. In the end, Heinrici surrendered to British forces at Plön on May 28th. After his capture, Heinrici was held at Island Farm, a British prisoner of war camp in Bridgend, South Wales, where he remained, except for a 3-week transfer to a US camp in October 1947, until his release on May 19, 1948. Heinrici was thoroughly interrogated by British forces about his actions during the war and his relationship with the Nazi leadership. Investigations revealed that, while he had been a loyal soldier to the German army, he was not involved in war crimes or atrocities committed by the SS or the Nazi Party. Ultimately, his apolitical stance and his distance from Hitler and his inner circle saved him from facing the severe accusations that other generals faced during the post-war trials. Like many other officers, Heinrici underwent a period of denazification. Although he was not a fervent Nazi, the denazification process was mandatory for all military officers of the Third Reich. Allied investigations into his record determined that Heinrici had not had direct involvement in the regime's ideological decisions and that his military career had focused primarily on tactical and strategic matters. This pragmatic approach allowed Heinrici to be treated with relative leniency by the British. In 1948, after spending 3 years in captivity, Heinrici was released without formal charges. His reputation as a competent military commander, yet distant from Nazi crimes, allowed him to avoid the fate of many of his colleagues who were prosecuted and convicted during the Nuremberg trials and other Allied military tribunals. After his release, Heinrici faced a devastated and divided Germany. Like many former German military personnel, his post-war future was uncertain. The German army had been dismantled, and high-ranking officers like Heinrici found themselves without a clear role in society. Despite his military achievements, Heinrici was not welcomed with honors in post-war Germany. The nation was trying to distance itself from its militaristic past, and war veterans were not celebrated in West Germany as they had been in previous years. During the post-war period, Heinrici lived a quiet life. He moved to the small town of Bad Godesberg near Bonn, where he lived with his family. His retirement was peaceful and largely isolated from politics and the public sphere. Heinrici rarely made public comments about his time in the military or the events of the war, and he stayed out of the political controversy that surrounded many former military personnel of the Third Reich. In the 1950s, Heinrici helped create the Operational History section of the United States Army Military History Center, established in January 1946, to leverage the operational knowledge and experience of German prisoners of war for the U.S. Army. He was also prominently featured in Cornelius Ryan's 1966 book, The Last Battle. Heinrici died in 1971 in Karlsruhe and was buried with full military honors at the Bergecker Cemetery in Freiburg im Breisgau. As a military commander, historians have described Heinrici as the Wehrmacht's top defensive expert and a genius admired by his peers, whose current obscurity may be due to the fact that, in the words of Samuel W. Mitchum, He was as charismatic as a 20-pound sack of fertilizer. British military historian B.H. Liddell Hart, who interviewed Heinrici after the war, described him in similar terms as a small man who speaks as if he is giving thanks and who hardly seems like a soldier. In 2014, Heinrici's private letters and diaries were compiled and published in a book edited by Johannes Hürter. In his writings, Heinrici revealed his growing doubts about Hitler's strategy and his increasing concern as the Wehrmacht became involved in war crimes and the early actions of the Holocaust. Heinrici's legacy remains complex. Although he was one of the most capable commanders of the German army during World War II, his rejection of Nazi fanaticism and his pragmatic approach to warfare set him apart from many of his colleagues. However, the context of the war and his participation in the German forces under the Nazi regime always tied him to a dark period in history. In retrospect, Heinrici is remembered as a general who valued the lives of his soldiers and strategic reality more than Hitler's suicidal orders. His effective defense of the Eastern Front and his refusal to participate in the regime's brutality place him in a morally ambiguous space, but one less controversial than that of other generals of his time. In the end, Heinrici distanced himself from war crimes and ideological fanaticism, but he could not escape the context in which he served. From ambition to abyss, Gotthard Heinrici and the fall of the Third Reich. The spring of 1945 marked the definitive end of the Third Reich, a regime that had sown terror and destruction in Europe for over a decade. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, the Nazi leaders faced a reality they had long tried to ignore. From the confines of the Führerbunker in Berlin, Hitler clung to the idea of a miraculous victory, surrounded by generals and officials oscillating between desperation and betrayal. Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, and other high-ranking regime officials sought ways to save themselves, but in the end, defeat was inevitable. As the Eastern Front crumbled, Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, attempted to delay the inevitable. With his characteristic pragmatism, Heinrici faced an unsustainable situation. His defensive tactics temporarily slowed the Red Army's advance, but the lack of resources and the disconnected orders from the Nazi high command undermined any real chance of resistance. The general knew that the fall of Berlin was imminent, but while he tried to mitigate the disaster, Nazi leaders in Berlin remained in a bubble of fantasy, unable to accept reality. One of the great symbols of the collapse of the Third Reich was Carinhall, Hermann Göring's opulent mansion. As Soviet troops advanced toward Berlin, Göring ordered the destruction of his residence to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. This act not only represented the end of his power, but also the downfall of a regime that had lived in excessive luxury at the expense of millions suffering. Göring, once Hitler's second-in-command, now found himself stripped of his influence and arrested by his own comrades. His fall was swift and brutal, culminating in his suicide shortly before being executed following the Nuremberg trials. On the other hand, Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful architects of the Third Reich, tried to save himself by secretly negotiating with the Allies. Himmler, who for years had led the SS and concentration camps, underestimated the distrust the Allies had toward him. Believing he could play a role in post-war Germany, Himmler found himself trapped between his personal ambition and the inevitable collapse of the regime he had helped build. His betrayal was discovered, and Hitler, feeling betrayed by one of his most loyal collaborators, dismissed him. Like many other Nazi leaders, Himmler committed suicide before facing justice. As these powerful men crumbled under the weight of their own decisions, German soldiers and citizens faced the war's final outcome. Despite his loyalty to the armed forces, Heinrici did not share Hitler's blind devotion or the fanaticism of his peers. As a general, he tried to protect his troops from unnecessary destruction, organizing strategic withdrawals and seeking to avoid massacres. However, the end was inevitable. On April 28, 1945, Heinrici was relieved of his command for disobeying orders to resist until the end. His pragmatic approach did not align with the suicidal ideal that Hitler had imposed on his army. Throughout the final days of the Third Reich, the disconnect between military reality and Hitler's expectations was a recurring theme. While the Soviets encircled and bombarded Berlin, Nazi leaders submerged themselves in a fantasy of power that no longer existed. Joseph Goebbels, one of the principal architects of Nazi propaganda, was perhaps the most fanatical of all. As the regime crumbled around him, Goebbels insisted that resistance must continue. Like other Nazi leaders, Goebbels chose suicide over surrender, taking his family with him in an act that symbolized the regime's brutality and desperation. However, not all Nazi leaders chose that path. Wilhelm Munke, in charge of defending the government district, and other military commanders tried to save their troops and civilians, even as they knew the war was lost. As Soviet forces closed in, German resistance became increasingly symbolic, an act of desperation rather than a viable military strategy. Berlin, the Reich's capital that had once promised to dominate Europe, was reduced to rubble, becoming the stage for Nazism's last battle. The surrender of Berlin on May 2, 1945, marked the final collapse of the Third Reich. Helmuth Weidling, who succeeded Heinrici in defending the city, made the difficult decision to surrender to avoid further destruction. With the city in ruins and most Nazi leaders dead or captured, the regime that had ruled with an iron fist for over a decade disintegrated completely. Despite its fall, the horrors of the Third Reich did not disappear with its collapse. War crimes, the atrocities of the Holocaust, and the devastation that Nazism caused across Europe left an indelible mark on history. The post-war trials, particularly the Nuremberg trials, brought to light the magnitude of the crimes committed by Nazi leaders, including figures like Göring and Himmler. These trials not only served to punish the guilty, but also established a legal precedent for crimes against humanity. The Nazi leaders, who once saw themselves as invincible, ended their days in isolation, betrayal, and despair. Their ambitions for total domination were crushed by the realities of war and the resistance of the peoples they had oppressed.